Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is part 3 of my child sex abuse series, and in this episode we have expert Jon Uhler coming momentarily. So there's this organization known as NAMBLA, N-A-M-B-L-A. Why am I mentioning them? NAMBLA is the North American Man-Boy Love Association, N-A-M-B-L-A. It was formed in 1978 by David Thorstad, a former Christian. You can't be a Christian and a former Christian, now an atheist, and proud advocate for the 2 forbidden P's. The organization operates under the belief that if more people knew about the nature of the typical man-boy love dynamic, which they confuse for love relationships, they somehow think that there would be less unjust scapegoating and persecution of boys who have these relationships with men. These are the words according to their website. To be clear, this website advocates for the 2 forbidden P's. You know, one can attempt to feel sympathy for these P's, and believe me, they do. There are whole TED Talks based around this topic. But should we be so quick to pardon this as a misunderstanding of a sexual orientation? Which it is not, by the way. Or should we perhaps believe the independent research that is not a part of commercial mainstream psychology, commercial mainstream medical references? These commercial mainstream organizations tend to push a homosexual agenda, a transgendered agenda, whereas if you rely on independent researchers, that can be usually more reliable. Well, let us go inside the mind of these kitty fiddler psychos. From this point onwards, this video will be a look into their mind, an attempt to see what they see and whether they truly do deserve our sympathy. Enter Jon Uhler. For those who are not aware, Jon Uhler has a master's, an LPC, and has been a professional therapist for over 25 years, working in a wide variety of clinical settings. He spent over 10 years working with adjudicated troubled teens prior to his 11 years working with incarcerated men with both medium and maximum prison settings, during which time he evaluated and treated approximately 4,000 low and high-risk sex offenders, including sexually violent predators. Jon's clinical specialty is trauma-based disorders, especially as it relates to the trauma associated with ritualistic sex abuse. Why did you decide to undergo that part of the equation as well?
Kind of by default, that I found myself working with the kinds of men who had harmed my previous clients, or the clients or people that ended up needing therapy. So I think I took that intensity, or my intensity, to try to find out why they did what they did. And I took that intensity into working with them. So I guess I was not your typical psychology staff member working within a prison, because I was not necessarily there just for job security, but I was doing, turns out, 11 years of research. My own research. I was very intense, very purposeful, every single day.
So I was listening to one of your podcasts earlier, and you stated something quite unusual that makes sense to me, but it's unusual as it's not the commercial narrative, and that is that just because you've been abused, you don't necessarily become an abuser. And I always said that when I used to watch Oprah as a kid, and then go, oh, well, the abused became the abuser. I was like, I don't get that. If someone raped me, I wouldn't then go out raping people. It didn't make sense. It never made sense to me. So when you said that, I was like, oh, that's something I've been saying for years, but that I never said out loud because it looks bad. So do you have any, or do you have any, of course you do. Do you want to
talk about why you made that statement and where you establish all of that from your
Sure.
research or whatever it is?
But I had read in the textbooks, and so I think I had absorbed what now I believe I call urban myths. And so we've heard it so many times from people that sound knowledgeable
Mm,
that we just believe hurt people, they hurt other people. So hurt people hurt people. We've also, if you take a poll of the average person that may understand these things kind of out in society, most people have come to believe that uh, sex offenders, sexual predators, primarily child offenders, are simply reenacting. Oh, you can hear my cat in the background. Most people have heard that perpetrators are reenacting or are driven to reenact their own abuse at the same age of their victims. So they will select victims that match
mhm.
the age that they were offended. They themselves were offended. Well, somehow we've all come to believe this. So if you ask anybody what the experts say, most people will regurgitate that, will repeat that. Uh,
Exactly.
who are we to question that? Because who knows,
They know more than us. Yeah.
right? So the next question would be, what is the mythology or I'm sorry, the methodology? What is the methodology by which they did their research? And most of us, the average person doesn't think through that next step. And that's not anybody's fault. We just assume, well, if someone's going to do research, it's going to be reliable. But the average person doesn't understand that for someone to try to do research into perpetrators behind bars, it's not like sitting down with the average person and doing kind of social science research. There's a whole
Mm,
process to gain access to the pool of offenders. Then you're not going to have access to all the offenders, really only those that are able to be interviewed, so that are behaving themselves, and that who have volunteered. And then the question is, why do they volunteer? So there's a whole lot of things I learned working behind bars for 11 years
I
that
love
I would
this.
never have known. And therefore, now I can definitively be able to speak to those who have done or speak about the research of those that have interviewed inmates. Because now I can begin to ask informed questions as far as who did they interview and how did they interview them. And I had access like no researcher, no outside researcher would ever dream of being able to have. I had a pair of keys.
That's
Right? I had a pair of keys. I could go anywhere in the prison on psych staff. I have access to everything, including records, corroborating information. I have access to all clinical files, medical, psychiatric, psychological, psychosocial. I have it all. Now, did I have access to unique things that other psychology staff members don't? No. But for whatever reason, those that work within prisons don't seem to be all that interested in doing intensive research, ironically. But those that want to do intensive research, they don't have the access. And because I knew I had a unique opportunity, I spent 11 years digging deep.
well
So
done.
I was able to then, especially in the sex offender groups, I was able to begin to test these different theories because they weren't jiving with what I knew about survivors. And so it was really by allowing the inmates, the sex offenders, to begin to float these different myths that I had read about that really piqued my interest. And I began to press into that. So the first time I heard a sex offender bring up that concept, I said, well, Mr. Uhler, hurt people hurt people. And I never heard it put in that that phraseology.
So it's like victimizing himself a little bit, going, "Oh, I couldn't help it because my dad did
There
it
you
to me,"
go.
or whatever it was. Yeah.
There you go. But probably for the first couple of groups, I allowed that because they would say it in such a quick fashion. And
It lets them off the hook. I don't like that.
yeah, well, but eventually it occurred to me what they were saying. And I remember the day and I remember the group, and I had 12 guys staring at me in a half circle, a wide range of offenses, at least in the US in sex offender treatment. It's not category specific. So you can have a wide range of different types of sex offenders in one group, which means
Oh,
about 3/4 of the group that have adult victims actually want to kill those that have harmed kids. So even within the population of sex offenders, there's still a sort of a pecking order.
because the one who hurts the child is the lowest of the low,
That's
correct?
right. That's right. So that is not myth. That's literal. Um, that's the dog there, in fact. So I remember the time when all of a sudden I'd heard that phrase floated again by a pedophile. I stopped him, and he floats the phrase, "Well, hurt people hurt people." And I said, "Define that." He says, "Well, I was hurt, and so I found myself acting out." I said, "Really?" And then I baited him. I said, "Man,
Good.
that must have really affected you when you were a child to be perked on like that." He said, "Oh yeah, it probably changed the course of your life." "Oh, Mr. Euler, you can't believe it. I probably wouldn't be sitting here." And so I
Mm.
let him go on, give him enough rope to hang himself. And I said, "Well, I'm just kind of curious then." So I worked with a lot of survivors. And so the question I have for you is, if you, knowing what it felt like and knowing the impact it had upon you, that, as you just said, it changed the course of your life. If you knew what it felt like, why would you want to do to someone else what was done to you, supposedly?
Yeah.
Right? And the look on his face and the look on the faces of the others, because when you have men in front of you sitting in a half circle, you have a vantage point. You have the advantage of seeing, as far as your perspective, you can see everybody's eyes and you can see the looks on their faces.
That was your
And
moment. That was like,
and trust me,
that
there
was
were a couple of those as I began to chip away at these myths. And the
what did he
look
do?
on,
Tell me.
I'm sorry.
So tell me. I want to know what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, well, he stopped and I said, so pray tell me why you would do to someone else, a child, what was done to you if you knew how badly it impacted you. And he stopped and he didn't have a response. I said, because you're lying through your teeth and you know it. He's just staring. I said, you're a grand liar. And you thought I would just buy what you said. I said, a quick assessment. If you want to know whether or not you're dealing with a survivor or not, find out whether or not they've offended. Because a survivor will never offend, especially a child. Survivors do not become exploitive. They become hypervigilant and overly protective. Just ask anybody who was raised by a parent, especially a mother who was a survivor. They will tell you, if you ask, well, what was it like to be raised by your mom? They'll say, oh, I'm making this up, but this is very common. Oh, she's a wonderful lady, but you know what? She was so controlled. She was always wanting to know where we were. We couldn't go anywhere. We couldn't go to slumber parties. We couldn't be out of her sight. They now call them helicopter parents.
Oh yes.
So she was we could tell that she was just so overly protective of us.
We're now living in a generation, in a time where people are coming out of the closet to announce that they are, attracted to minors. And some are celebrating it. Why do you think that is?
The reason why men perpetrate against children is because they want to.
Of course. It's a disgusting predilection, right? It's
But let that sink in. The second reason they do it is they are porn fueled. They are fueled by pornography. Prior to pornography and the internet, pedophiles are neither the result of nature or nurture.
okay. So they just are?
Neither nature, not genetic, and it's not nurture. It's not their home life.
Okay.
It is choice out of deviance. The pathway down to deviance, and deviance is lust on steroids that has become inverted. It's very different.
Mm.
I use a term, and it's no better term that I've come up with it, is normal lust. Okay. When most people think of pedophiles and they think of sex offenders, they will project onto the offender that the offender has done what they've done because of lust. Because we all know what it's like, especially for men, that once lust takes hold, a very unique dynamic starts to build. But most people will stop within the realm of lust. They are unaware that lust goes somewhere, and it starts to feed upon itself in a way, and it eventually transitions downward in terms of morals.
Yeah.
It becomes very twisted, and the motivation moves from or beyond lust into deviance. There's a technical term for deviance that is aroused by somebody else's pain.
It is developed throughout time. They weren't born with an attraction to minors. They chose it. They chose to rid themselves of a conscience, rid themselves of any human emotion because it stands in their way. They do not deserve our sympathy.
But they have entered into the realm of deviance, and deviance eventually descends into psychopathy. So they are no longer human, they are psychopaths. When someone becomes a psychopath, Robert Hare was the first person, and I'm certified in the PCLR, the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, that the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections flew him out for a very unique training. So I was a part of that. And you can summarize psychopathy in three ways, or you boil it down to three things. So Robert Hare coined the phrase white collar psychopath. He indicated there are two types of psychopaths. Now, his claim to fame is he's the first person that ended up putting psychopaths through brain imaging scans. And so you can go on Google, bring it up on the internet, brain scans of psychopaths. And now a lot of people, including James Fallon, it's interesting when you listen to these guys try to extrapolate from what they see into the reasons behind. How did somebody become a psychopath? Because what you'll find is this: there is no doubt any longer, because of science, because of brain imaging, that a psychopathic brain is very different than a regular brain, and it can never go back. So once someone becomes a psychopath, they will always be a psychopath, which is very interesting.
They can't find salvation in Christ. They can't.
How did you know I was going to bring that up? It really has simply shown what Romans.
Sorry, that makes me sad. That's all.
Well, it simply has shown. Science now has simply shown what Romans chapter 1 talks about.
Romans chapter 1 verses 28 to 32. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, and disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them.
And I really think once you begin to let that sink in, where a reprobate mind is. So psychology is late in the game. It comes along and comes up with this term called psychopath.
Yeah.
But 2,000 years ago, Paul used the term reprobate mind. What is a reprobate mind? It is a mind that is given over to now a different state that no longer can function as a mind was designed to do, especially by God, which is especially this. In terms of moral assessment and decision making, it no longer works. So they are no longer human. They are a human doing, but not a human being. So they are functional. But what's interesting is this. For someone that has entered into psychopathy, and again, you really have two categories of psychopaths, bloody psychopath and white collar psychopath. What is the difference? White collar psychopaths are smarter. Bloody psychopaths, that's who we normally think of, like in the movie Psycho from Alfred Hitchcock. Yeah. But with a bloody psychopath, the body count is going to be fairly small.
Because they have to do it slowly.
They're going to get busted.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I understand.
So, the most dramatic serial killers may have 80 to 90 bodies, so to speak. But a sophisticated psychopath, especially a pedophile, they can have 400 to 500 victims. And no one suspects them. So who's better at being a psychopath? It would be the white-collar psychopath. You have Robert Hare's example of a white-collar psychopath was Bernie Madoff here in the U.S. He was head of NASDAQ.
I know that name.
Yeah, he committed the largest white-collar crime. He was head of the NASDAQ in the U.S. But somebody can go online and read about him. So he ripped people off to the tune of millions and millions. I think even potentially billions.
But that doesn't sound psychopathic. That just sounds like fraud.
Correct. And so the question is this: what kind of mind?
Still bad.
What kind of mind do you have to be able to bleed somebody dry financially to where they are now going to be destitute? So instead of bleeding them physically, you bleed them dry in other ways. They still have, their hearts are still beating, so technically they're still human, but they've lost their humanity. And here's something for the Christian audience, and that if I start to violate my conscience, there's going to be a process that starts to be put into play or starts to be brought to bear. And it starts with a person wanting a conscience and valuing a conscience and not wanting to violate it. The more you start to transgress or violate your conscience, something very real happens to where as you start, it becomes easier to violate it the next time, to ignore it than violate it. As that happens, you start to become calloused. And so the amount of pain that has to be applied to get through to you is ratcheted up. So the volume of the pain starts to go up, but the deafening process, the deadening of the conscience starts to where a person transitions from wanting a conscience to being bothered by their conscience to being eventually bothered that their conscience is bothering them, to eventually being bothered that they have a conscience, to getting to a point where they start to find relief that their conscience is no longer bothering them, to finally being very pleased that their conscience doesn't bother them. And now the only thing that bothers them are those that have a conscience. If you ask that person, would they ever want to go back? They look at you like you're a putz, because they know you are governed by a conscience, but they're free from it. And so the greatest compliment, but it was one of the most pejorative terms that these guys sometimes would use. They would say, you know what your problem is? And so what? You're such a Boy Scout. Internally, right and wrong, good and bad, truly have become inverted. And along with that goes the desire to ever want anything different. And that really is, I believe, what the Lord superimposes And once somebody figures that out, meaning the more I violate my conscience, I move from being bothered that I have violated my conscience, meaning I'm bothered that I did it, to I'm bothered that my conscience is bothering me. So that's kind of a lower level of moral development. To I just kind of want to be able to live and let live. So that's another level. To I'll do it if I can get away with it a little bit. To I'll do it, and you know what? If it feels good to me, I'll do it. So you can begin to see there's various stages then what happens morally, to where the furthest stage is what we read in scripture about the wicked are restless. They're like the churning ocean. They can never be still. They always have to plot and scheme because they're driven. And if you ask them, why do you do what you do? They would look at you and say, what are you talking about? I'm doing me. This is what I do. Somebody who is deviant is motivated by the idea of inflicting pain or discomfort. And that's the key difference. Once somebody begins to understand that, and I didn't understand that until working with these guys, it all of a sudden occurred to me that I was working with a population of men who are so far removed from normal relationships. And I remember the group that I finally, it clicked for me. So I looked at these guys, I said, guys, you don't even know how whacked out you are. And they're all kind of staring at me. I said, you don't even know that a normal person can't get sexually excited if they know their partner isn't enjoying themselves. Let that sink in. Meaning a sex offender, let alone a pedophile, has morphed into someone that the pleasure of the other person
is irrelevant.
They left that 7 exits ago. Now, as a matter of fact, it's now about if they don't have a sense of, at the very least, is power and control, but manipulation, then power and control. If they don't believe they're doing something to another person, at the very least, that I'm ripping them off. I'm playing them as a fool. But as that person progresses from lust into deviance, that which drives them, that which turns them on, is actually not the physical anymore. It's the emotional impact. And the further they go, the more they derive satisfaction from and is the primary motivating force. I mean, the physical becomes secondary. They're now driving after the impact and effect they can have upon someone. The most extreme form of that is wanting to traumatize someone.
They get joy out of watching someone tortured, essentially.
There you go. But a stage just shy of that is defiling. And that's what drives a pedophile. The knowledge of being able to defile. By the time somebody's a child offender, they've already gotten into really, really deviant and dark porn, including bestiality. There's got it. Okay. I would not.
Are you serious?
100%. And
but that's a different level again.
Do a Google search and just type in, child offender arrested with child porn and bestiality porn.
Okay.
And so what you're going to find is this, and what I heard from the inmates. So over time, I was plotting out the pathway of porn as well. And I found that bestiality comes before child perpetration. And that's why when somebody is child porn, there's always going to be in that stash, there's going to be bestiality. But someone that's into bestiality may not have progressed into child offending. That's how vile a child offender is. Any child that's been perpetrated upon will spend the rest of their life wrestling with two things: their own self-image and self-concept, and eligibility to be loved and receive love, and their concept of God.
Well, I hope part 3 has been of interest to you all. Remember, there are more important things in the world right now. I want to get this out there. It is extremely important.